Hello, this is a brief history of Japan. Obviously, there is no way within the bounds of three brief lectures that I'll be able to convey the full complexity of any nation or culture, especially as an outsider. But for those interested in a brief overview, which I hope you'll use as a jumping board to learn more, I am happy to provide this abbreviated history of Japan. This is the first of three lectures. Lecture number one, origins. So modern Japan is an archipelago. It's a chain of several islands. For comparison, if you were to somehow fuse together all of the Japanese islands into one, it would be about the size of California. As you can see, there are four main islands: Kyushu, Shikoku, Honshu, and Hokkaido. And then there are many, many, many smaller islands as well. Japan is one of the least ethnically diverse regions in the world, or most ethnically homogeneous. About 99% of the Japanese population identifies as ethnically Japanese. There are small minorities of Korean, Chinese, Ainu, or indigenous people extraction, and also some folk of European background who live there as well. So if we're talking about origins, there are several ways we can approach that issue. One, of course, is through the lens of mythology. So in Japanese creation myths, we have a pantheon of gods, and two in particular, Izanagi and Izanami. They're sort of the prime gods. And in the mythological origin story of Japan, they create the Japanese islands by driving a spear beneath the ocean and pulling up pieces of land. And this was, according to the myth, the first land pulled up in the creation of the world. And if you want to run that myth in parallel with a scientific paradigm, you've got an extremely active volcanic substructure in Japan. It's right along the so-called Ring of Fire in the Pacific Rim. And so there are regular earthquakes and eruptions that bring forth islands out from beneath the sea. In the mythological narrative, as it continues, Izanami and Izanagi have a daughter, Amaterasu, and in turn her son becomes the forerunner of the imperial lineage in Japan. And all emperors since the earliest recordings of Japanese history have claimed descent from that divine line. And in fact, technically up until 1945 and the US conquest of Japan, the emperor was still regarded as a divine figure well into the Age of Enlightenment in Japan. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, that there are still people today who in their own memory remember being raised to believe the emperor was in fact a divine creature. So the name Japan is obviously a name that has been anglicized. Japanese call their country Nihon or Nippon. It means roughly source of the sun or origin of the sun. And so if you're talking in the West, if you consider Japan the nation farthest to the east, if you're imagining the world as a flat rectangle with the center being in Western Europe, then indeed Japan is the farthest east you can go. So that worked very well into Western concepts, and so you have this expression, land of the rising sun, that you may have heard when it comes to giving Japan a moniker. That kind of has its roots also in the Japanese etymology as well. So again, Nihon or Nippon means sun origin. This name has its own history. The earliest records we have in writing of anyone referring to Japan come from China, and that land that we now call Japan was called Wa, meaning harmony, in 8th century Chinese records. The native Japanese equivalent of that name more or less is Yamato, and although you don't really hear people refer to themselves in Japan as the Yamato people today, that is still sort of an original identity in the Japanese language for the Japanese people and their nation. And how we got from either Nippon or Wa or Yamato to Japan kind of comes by way of a game of historical telephone that the southern coastal Chinese dialect takes Yamato and turns it into Sipangu. And again, please forgive my very poor Chinese pronunciation. And then when people from Malay peoples traded with them, they kind of turned Sipangu into Japang. And then when the Portuguese come to Southeast Asia, they take Japang and turn it into Japan. And that's how it persists in English. So that's a very interesting journey from, from Wa to Japan, or Yamato to Japan. As early as 8000 BC is when we have records of people living on the Japanese islands. Today, these people are referred to as the Ainu, although in Japanese they're often called the Jomon people when they're being talked about in prehistory, and contemporarily they're called the Ainu. That's also a name by which the people refer to themselves these days. If you are familiar with the works of Miyazaki Hayao, who is a famous anime director of Studio Ghibli, who creates sort of these internationally popular animated movies. Princess Mononoke, or Mononoke Hime in Japanese, is probably the most famous portrayal of an Ainu person. Prince Ashitaka, the protagonist, is the last prince of the Emishi people, who are descended from the Ainu. Obviously, this is not a representation by Ainu people themselves, but nonetheless, it's still probably the most popular representation of the indigenous people of Japan in global media. And part of the reason that other people are propagating the stories of the Ainu and not the Ainu themselves is that really by about 300 AD, the Ainu start to become massively displaced by settlers from China and Korea who invade their lands. And in some ways, it's a very similar story to the European invasion and displacement of Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere. The Ainu are driven off their lands and killed either by force or by disease in mass numbers over the ensuing centuries. And the new settlers who come from Korea and southern China call themselves alternatively the Yamato, as I mentioned, the Yayoi, or in Chinese incorporation to Japanese language, Wajin, harmony people. So Japan is a very mountainous place. There's not much arable land. It explains why the Ainu for thousands of years subsisted as hunter-gatherers. But these new settlers coming from Korea and from China, they're used to agricultural society. And so they start to set up the agricultural model that has worked for them and their ancestors, which consists of rice farming. This means that you have populations that cluster tightly in the very small, comparatively, areas that are arable. So from the beginning of settlement in Japan from the people who will become the Japanese people today, you have this tightly packed, highly densely populated space. And these rice kingdoms become the early forerunners of Japan's cities today, which continue to have a very high population density. By comparison, the metro Tokyo area has about as many people as the entire country of Canada. That gives you a sense of both how spread out Canada is and how densely packed Tokyo is. As if the shortage of arable land and those crowded settlements weren't potentially stressful enough for these settlers, Japan also lies, as I mentioned, on several major fault lines. And so earthquakes and tsunami are frequent occurrences, even today, but back then there was certainly less technological infrastructure available to mitigate the impacts of those disasters. So although the official name for Japan, again, is Source of the Sun, another name for it in Japanese is the Land of Tears, because natural disasters and tragedy were so very frequent. I don't think it's an accident that Buddhism eventually becomes so popular here. Buddhism containing, among other things, an emphasis on impermanence, on the fleetingness of life. And you see that in Japanese poetry from the very beginning up through today, this emphasis on the transitory nature of all things. So when you're looking at Japanese history, again, it begins, as with many cultures' history, in the realm of myth prior to the advent of written records that we can then kind of go back and try and cross-check. And so one of the first rulers of Japan who we read about in the records of others, particularly in the records of Chinese, is Empress Himiko, who was a powerful matriarchal ruler. She was the person with whom early Chinese envoys apparently negotiated with. And I always find that interesting because certainly once the centuries start to pass, women have comparatively less agency in Japan than they might have in other, post-Enlightenment Western cultures. But it is interesting that there is this this deeply baked history of powerful female rulers as well. But let's talk about the folks that we do have the most records from. So these new settlers, they are bringing writing from China and from Korea, this tradition of imperial rule and structure, but eventually that language and culture starts to take on some changes. And you can think of that perhaps analogous to when any kind of organism becomes isolated from the parent group it began with. Think of Darwin's finches and how when isolated on different islands, they evolved literally different physical features to match their environment. Culture changes much more quickly than biological features do, and language is one of the quickest things to change of all. So what becomes the Japanese language really becomes quickly very different from its Chinese and Korean forerunners. If you think about, for example, how you say hello. In Chinese, ni hao. In Korean, annyeonghaseyo. In Japanese, konnichiwa. Right? That sounds like neither of the two parent languages. And Japanese has far more of an influence linguistically from Korean than it does from Chinese, at least in the spoken language. We'll get to the written language in a moment. Or thank you. In Chinese, sheshe. In Korean, kamsamnida. In Japanese, arigato. So again, the language quickly becomes quite different. In terms of written language, Japanese actually has technically four written character sets. The first is kanji, and kanji is literally the same ideographic alphabet as the Chinese. And alphabet is perhaps a misnomer. I should say character set, because Chinese characters are not merely phonetic, they are pictographic. So each character represents a concept. Two characters together represent an idea, an ideograph. And kanji is still in use today, but other orthography, other character sets also evolve. There is a phonetic set, hiragana, which interestingly enough, its origin is also very tied to issues of gender and female empowerment, in that women were banned generally from learning the Chinese kanji. And so one of the posited origins of hiragana is it was the language, the written language that women created in order to have their own character set that they could then use for writing and reading. And so a given Japanese word will have both kanji, but also its equivalent that you can write phonetically with hiragana. And just to make things more interesting, there is a third character set, katakana, which is used exclusively for words that are not Japanese in origin. So you are always reminded that these are foreign concepts, words like kohi, coffee, or interneto, which you can probably figure out. Westerners' names, like my name, David, would be debeto, and you would write it in katakana. And this goes far back. At this point, even the popular Japanese noodle dish, ramen, is actually written in katakana, because ramen is the same word as lomen, as in lo mein, as in Chinese noodles. They came from China very long time ago, but still there's that distinction. Nope, that's foreign. We write it with a different character set. And then much more recently, there is romaji, which is the Romanized alphabet. And so most Westerners' first access to Japanese comes by way of romaji. And many Japanese people are familiar with Romaji these days, although it's seldom written out that way unless the audience is Western. So here's just an example of some Japanese writing. It's actually a very nice poem, and it's a poem about impermanence, if you're curious, and you can notice that within it, right, you've got kanji over here, you've got some hiragana over here. I don't see any katakana, but you can see how the kanji and the hiragana co-occupy. So the land that is now considered Japan is still a series of different kingdoms. It doesn't become united and centralized for a couple of hundred years, but there is still this sort of general idea of fealty, rather, to the emperor. And the emperor is sort of whichever family is coming from, whichever family is dominant at the time, and then that place where the dominant family is in that area is considered the cultural capital, and eventually this coalesces into one spot that doesn't move depending on which family is in charge. First that's in the city of Nara, and then later for the longest time in Kyoto. And once the Japanese unified land, so to speak, becomes centered in Kyoto, becomes more of a centralized political state, the structure of it, again, feels very much like Imperial China or Imperial Korea. There is the emperor and the imperial family at the center. There is the aristocracy around them, and then descending ranks of important families beneath them. And eventually you get to the majority of the people, who are the peasants and the merchants and the farmers. There's definitely this sense carried over from the Chinese and Korean courts of courtly chivalry and refinement. If you're an aristocrat, you are supposed to be well versed in arts, different kinds of learning, dress elegantly. Again, the capital used to move every time there was a new imperial family, but it settles down into the city that we now call Kyoto, but at the time was called Heian-kyo, or peaceful capital, capital of peace. It was modeled after Chang'an in China in terms of having appropriate feng shui and geomancy in its creation, so everything was oriented in directions and structures that were considered to be particularly auspicious. It's in this era that you have this incredible flowering of literature and poetry, and once again, we have these examples of very powerful and prominent women, even if they did not necessarily hold great political power. They were certainly big in the literary scene. You have authors like, say, Shonagon, and she is the author of the famous or perhaps infamous Pillow Book, and her arch rival, Lady Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote what is considered to be the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji. It's enormous. It's a 1,000-page epic collection of the adventures of this prince named Genji, who is kind of a player, as we would say, I guess back in the slang of my youth. He has many love affairs, and all kinds of misadventures ensue. Tale of Genji is sort of held up in the same regard as Shakespeare might be in the West, and particularly in the sense that Murasaki really plays with language in much of the same way that Shakespeare did, and students in Japan often approach Murasaki with the same mixture of respect and dread that they do in the West with Shakespeare. So speaking of respect and dread, the emperor increasingly gets less of that as the centuries go on. Maybe not less respect or dread, but certainly less political power. The emperor becomes increasingly more of a figurehead. His role tends to be far more ceremonial. In fact, he's practically a prisoner within the imperial palace grounds, and his every waking second is occupied with various kinds of religious ritual. It's actually not uncommon for emperors to resign after a comparatively short reign, and one of the reasons for doing that is they actually have much more freedom once they are not in that imperial role. And one of the reasons for that change is you start to see the rise of these powerful aristocratic families known as the Kuge families, who are really the ones running the show and pulling all of the financial and political strings and just sort of getting the emperor's chop on official documents, when necessary. So I mentioned a little bit with religious ritual. Time to take a little bit of a detour and talk about religion in Japan. So the vast majority of Japanese today practice religion in some syncretic fusion of Shintoism, which is the contemporary name for the religion that the original Yamato Yayoi people practiced, and Buddhism, which was sort of a late comer to the Japanese islands. So let's talk a little bit about Shinto first. Shinto is an animistic religion. That means there is a belief that the physical world around us is just one reflection of reality. There is also this spiritual world that coexists with our reality. And entities from that spiritual plane not only interact with those of us in the physical world, but in fact inhabit and manifest in it. Every animal, every feature of nature, like a tree or a lake or a mountain, certain objects, certain households have a spirit, a kami. And those kami have to be respected, sometimes placated. Some of them are hostile, and so you might need to engage beneficial kami to protect you from them. Shinto influence, again, is something that I think the rest of the world has been exposed to through a lot of Japanese anime, movies like Kami no Sento, or Spirited Away, or again, Princess Mononoke, really go heavily into Shinto mythology. You've got this concept called miyabe, which is aesthetic harmony, that all of the senses should be operating in sync to really experience reality to the fullest. So I'm a big fan of sushi. Sushi has to look a certain way, feel a certain way, taste a certain way in order to really be embodying what sushiness is supposed to embody. So Buddhism kind of arrives about more or less 3-ish centuries into the Japanese settlement of the islands. And it's when a particular Korean monarch sends a mission to Japan with gifts, including the image of the Buddha, and some sacred texts in Pali, in the original language of Buddhist scripture. And there are some up-and-coming Japanese power brokers who kind of see this as an opportunity. Buddhism really is centuries older than this. It starts out in India. But by the time it arrives in Japan, there are folks who are aware that this is an influential religion in the larger region, and this can be a way for them to get a foothold of power if they're able to propagate it and be the folks who are its patrons. And so you have these conflicts in the mid-centuries of the first millennium in Japan between pro and anti-Buddhist groups, and the pro-Buddhist groups win out. The religion eventually does receive imperial sponsorship. That doesn't mean Shinto goes away. Neither Buddhism nor Shinto are exclusive religions. They can coexist. You can be both. And so, again, today, most Japanese identify as both. There are 13 different schools of Buddhism in Japan. Perhaps Westerners are most familiar with Zen Buddhism, but there are many different kinds of Buddhism in Japan. There are about 80,000 temples, about 150,000 priests, some colleges devoted to Buddhist studies. Just to sidetrack into a little bit about Buddhism, it's one of the 5 largest religions in the world, although some Buddhists would argue it's not really a religion, it's more of a way of life, a philosophy. It remains the dominant religion in most of Southeast Asia and in large parts of China and India. Again, Buddhism gets its start around 500-ish BCE. According to Buddhist legends, it begins with a Hindu priest named Siddhartha Gautama. This prince has an overprotective father who wants to shield him from all the sufferings of the world, but young Siddhartha, like many adolescents, wants to find out answers for himself. He's not going to just accept the word of his elders. And so he sneaks out of the palace and discovers that outside this perfect world his father has curated, outside the matrix, as it were, there is pain and there is suffering everywhere. And he can't get it out of his mind. And he wants to come up with a solution to that universal human problem. And because he begins life as a Hindu, that religion also incorporates this idea of impermanence. Everything changes, and he kind of comes to this unpleasant realization that no matter how wealthy or happy he might be now, eventually he and everyone he loves is going to get old, is going to get sick, is going to suffer, and is going to die. And as a Hindu, he also believes in reincarnation, which means you're going to have to go through that again and again. You're always reborn again and again. And this chain of change and suffering never ends, even if you're a god. So what is a mere mortal to do? Well, Siddhartha decides to go on a quest to find out the answer to that question. So he abandons his home and his family and all of his riches, and he goes searching for a way out of this trap of eternal suffering. So he tries yoga, he tries separating his mind from his body, he gains all of these kind of magical powers according to the Buddhist holy texts. He spends some time abandoning all of his possessions and lives as an ascetic, trying to free himself from distractions, and none of it seems to work. And he learns a lot, but he can't figure out how to get free of this endless cycle of suffering. So eventually he sits down beneath a Bodhi tree and meditates. And sometimes when you're not, so caught up in finding an answer, the answer comes to you. That's what happens in the story of Siddhartha. The solution hits him. And at this point he becomes enlightened, Buddhists believe. He reaches this state called nirvana, where he finds a kind of inner peace that no suffering can touch. And that's when he takes on the title of Buddha. And again, Buddha is a title. And it means sort of enlightened person, and he dedicates his life to teaching others how to reach this state, which he feels is possible for anyone. And that's a very radical idea for his time and place, because he comes from a Hindu caste system, which says that your caste really dictates your opportunities in life. And he says basically that this solution he's found works for anyone, whether you're a Brahmin at the top of the social chain or an untouchable at the very bottom. So, or Dalit, I think is the more appropriate word for that caste. So the Buddha's plan was for people to realize the four noble truths. Number one, all of life is suffering. If you boil down life, that's what it is. You can't escape it. Because we are trapped by desire and attachment. But it is possible to escape this trap and attain nirvana. And again, it's accessible to anyone who chooses to follow this path. So in terms of this concept, right, we get attached to things, we get attached to people, we get attached to the idea of ourselves, and when these things change or go away, then we feel sad. And the Buddha says, well, there's a way out of that. And it's called the Noble Eightfold Path, and it's very complicated. I'm certainly not a Buddhist scholar myself, but it involves, in the very basic level, giving up your attachments to things, to people, to beliefs and causes, to your very sense of self, and trying to get yourself in this point where you're in the moment. You're focused on the here and now, on your body, on your immediate surroundings and actions. And when you do that, the Buddha felt you would only act in right ways, in ways that help others and the world. And if you master these abilities, it's not that you're going to change the objective realities of the world, that things are going to change, that people are going to get sick, that you're going to have troubles. But he felt that you can reach a state where you don't suffer from it, where you just sort of note it and experience it, and it doesn't cause you agony. So that's sort of Buddhism in a very limited nutshell, a way to try and build inner peace in a turbulent world, and to teach others how to find that yourselves. And the Buddha didn't feel he was the first to figure that out. He didn't think he would be the last. In fact, there's a whole concept in Buddhism of a bodhisattva, of someone who attains enlightenment and then sticks around for a while to help other people attain enlightenment. So the Buddhist worldview, because it combines with so many other religions in the places where it comes to, can look very different in different parts of the world. And the cosmology could include all kinds of gods and monsters, and some Buddhists take these literally and others see them as metaphors, as manifestations of people's own subconscious feelings. So again, Buddhism might look different in different parts of the world. And in Japan, it came looking a lot like Korean Buddhism and a little bit like Chinese Buddhism, but then it merges with Shinto and it starts to incorporate visuals from that tradition as well. One of my favorite Buddhist phrases in Japanese is mono no aware, which basically means you're recognizing that everything is impermanent. Everything is going to change. So if you go to a Japanese religious site, you're often going to see Shinto and Buddhist items very close to each other. So if you see a torii gate, which looks like this, this is a sign that you're entering a Shinto space. This is the mark of separation between the spiritual world and the physical world. And so if you're at a temple that's exclusively Buddhist, it's not going to have one of these. If it's Buddhist and Shinto combined, then it will. And Shinto also sometimes has shrines that are just Shinto. And that's just how it goes in Japan. But you'll also see these structures like, for example, these stone dogs, these kominu, which are sort of guardian spirits. And that's a combination of Shinto, but also they're incorporated into Buddhism, and they're sometimes interpreted as symbolizing the destruction of your unhealthy desires. There might be a place for you to purify yourself ritually by washing your hands and your mouth. So should you come to a temple or shrine, you're going to want to make sure that you do that. I don't suggest actually drinking the water. You might want to just pantomime it. So that's sort of more of a Shinto ritual, but then a Buddhist ritual is this stick of incense that you light, and that's often a Buddhist tradition. You might see these fearsome looking temple guardians that started out as Shinto deities, but then kind of get remastered into Buddhist representations of the triumph of Buddhist thought over desire and the material world. So believe it or not, those angry looking folks there are actually seen today as very positive figures, sort of cheering you on, as it were, providing you a model for living a good Buddhist life. And then you usually have a complex of buildings, and in the center you've got this primary temple, the kondo, where some of the biggest icons and statues will be. And then you'll often see a lot of people selling things for fundraising for the temple. And in a Judeo-Christian context, this might evoke the image or the story of Jesus in the temple and kind of casting them out. There really is no such disconnect, at least in contemporary Japan, between sort of the material world being in place there. Maybe some hardcore Buddhists might take exception, but I think that the practicalities of fundraising are pretty well established in contemporary Buddhist temples. You'll of course see various Buddhist icons. You'll see statues that are sort of a merger between the fat Chinese Buddha, who's actually the Chinese kitchen god who gets remastered into a Buddha, and also some thinner Indian-looking Buddhas, and the Japanese Buddhas are kind of somewhere in between. Kannon, or she's called Guanyin in Chinese, or Avalokitesvara, I believe, in Hindi. She's the bodhisattva of compassion and mercy, and she's a very popular icon in Japanese temples. You'll also see pagodas, these tall buildings that hold holy relics. Some are reputed to contain the bodily remains of famous Buddhist leaders. And you'll see these sort of lightning rod looking structures on top. And that's because these are wooden buildings. You don't want them struck by lightning and getting set on fire. And these days, sometimes they're called demon stoppers. I find that to be particularly interesting. Again, here's another map of a layout of a typical Buddhist temple. You can spend really a whole afternoon at some of the larger temples. You might see Shinto markers around as well, these stone lanterns, which again, in olden days, these were your street lights. Nowadays, mostly they're just used for ceremonies. And then you might see these gorinto. These are actually grave markers. I won't go into the details in this lecture of the different schools of Japanese Buddhism, but you're welcome to freeze the slide and read it at your leisure. Buddhist temples, because they come from different sects, sometimes would actually, in ancient times, make war on each other. It was often common for monks to be trained in martial arts, and you would have these literal wars between the adherents of different Buddhist sects, and the local rulers would often sort of manipulate or somehow pick sides and get involved in these complex Game of Thrones type relationships. Today, the different factions generally just agree to disagree, and that's probably a good thing. In polls, most Japanese people today identify as secular. Religion is really something that tends to get practiced during festivals, weddings, and funerals. But if you go to Japan, it's not uncommon to see a Buddhist pilgrim walking the streets, seeking enlightenment. Sometimes you might find people who have had a tragedy in their life making a Buddhist pilgrimage. That hat is often a signal in this notice as well that they're going on a pilgrimage route. So that kind of brings us to around the late 1100s. That's when the golden age of Heian era Japan lasts up until, and we'll talk about what replaces it in the next lecture.